Hello and welcome back to the Bio 122 video lectures. This is video 18 on digestive system processes from chapter 34 of the textbook. And the steps of digestion, well, we can also refer to the videos we've already done, talking about the different steps along the way of human digestive system from the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. These figures from your textbook show a couple of important uh, summaries that if we look at where do we propel, so the force of propulsion, which is always going to come through contraction of smooth muscle, we propel food along in basically two ways. One, the swallowing process, but then we have peristalsis, which is the rhythmical contraction of smooth muscle along several parts, from the esophagus to the stomach to the small intestine and large intestine are all uh, participating in the propulsion of food through the digestive tract. We also have several times in which we have differences of chemical digestion and also mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion occurs first in the oral cavity. So we also can look on the slide to the right where we have mechanical digestion, which is done by the teeth. The chewing action, but also the tongue contributes because it is moving the food around, forming the bolus, and then the process of swallowing will actually pull the food apart. So all of that could be considered mechanical digestion. And then the stomach has churning actions because of the smooth muscle oriented in different directions. But also the process of peristalsis through the small intestine is also going to be pulling and segmenting the food into smaller and smaller pieces, which will aid in digestion. We also have several points in which we do chemical digestion, which are illustrated a little bit better in the figure on the right. So that if we look in the oral cavity, not only do we have mechanical digestion, but remember we also start chemical digestion of carbohydrates, specifically starches, using salivary amylase. And then in the stomach is the first time that we get absorption of proteins, chemical digestion of proteins, because that's where the pepsin enzyme is located. As we go from the small intestine to the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, in addition to the mechanical digestion that occurred in the stomach and will also occur in the small intestine, this is the first time that we actually get chemical digestion beginning of lipids and nucleic acids. And we're additionally adding more enzymes to break down carbohydrates and proteins. As we go into the large intestine, however, there's really no chemical digestion, at least not by us. There is a form of digestion by the bacteria, but that's not to form particular nutrients for us, it's the nutrients for the bacteria, except they will process and produce certain vitamins, particularly vitamin K will be produced in the large intestine, but that's by bacteria. Now, if we look at places where we absorb, the nutrients and water are all going to be absorbed in the intestines. But it's the small intestine that does the bulk of the absorption. So the peptides, the amino acids. So this is the product of the digestion of proteins, glucose and fructose molecules, which are the products of the breakdown of carbohydrates, and then lipids, and also water, and then the minerals and vitamins will be absorbed in the small intestine. Now, there can be absorption of things in the stomach, particularly drugs, things like aspirin. but things that are highly lipid soluble. But when we talk about aspirin, of course, that's not a nutrient. That's just simply something that is lipid soluble and we're using it as a medication. But we don't consider the stomach as being any significant absorption of nutrients. And then as we go down to the large intestine, we still get absorption, but primarily that absorption is water and uh, the remaining amounts of minerals and vitamins and a few ions, sodium, potassium, which would also could be classified as minerals. So the vast majority of the absorption, of course, is occurring in the small intestine, and it's a small amount, mostly water, that's going to be absorbed in the large intestine. Okay, now just kind of a summary of protein digestion in general. So a few key topics to always remember is that the largest portion of protein digestion actually occurs in the stomach. It doesn't finish in the stomach, but it will be broken from proteins, which are hundreds of thousands to millions of amino acids, down into peptides. And the peptide is only a couple of dozen of amino acids. So there's an enormous reduction in the size of the proteins in the stomach, breaking down to peptides. And then the final process, breaking those peptides into amino acids, that will occur in the small intestine from enzymes that are secreted by the pancreas and also by the walls of the small intestine itself. Now, where are we going to absorb the amino acids? They get absorbed in the small intestine directly into the bloodstream. So then if we look at the difference between that and lipid digestion, is that lipid digestion really doesn't even begin until we're past the stomach. Of any significant amount, but we do actually begin very slightly with a couple of lipases that do exist in the gastric juice. So gastric lipase and lingual lipase does actually exist, but compared to what's happening with the proteins, it's fairly minor. The bulk of lipid digestion instead doesn't occur until the chyme gets to the duodenum, because lipid digestion requires the presence of bile. And the bile is produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder, and it's secreted into the duodenum. At that point, the digestion of lipids proceeds very rapidly from enzymes that are released by the pancreas, the pancreatic lipase. Then the lipids also get absorbed very quickly into from the small intestine, but instead of going directly into the bloodstream, lipids go into lymphatic system, which is actually part of our immune system. But this is one of the specialized functions of the lymphatic system, and it's because lipids will not dissolve into the blood very well because the blood is mostly water. And so the lymphatic system actually has some specialized transporters in it that will allow it to pick up and carry the lipids into it. And then eventually the lymphatic system will deposit those lipids into a major vein in the body. Carbohydrates are the last major nutrient, and we actually begin the process of breaking down starches right there in the oral cavity using the amylase. And that is a large polysaccharide. So the complex carbohydrates, together with things like glycogen, would be broken down by an amylase, but that only breaks it down into a disaccharide. And the disaccharides would be maltose, sucrose, and lactose. But sometimes we actually consume lactose because that's what's in milk. Sometimes we consume sucrose directly because that's what's in table sugar. So that process really doesn't even start breaking the disaccharides down until you get to the small intestine, because sucrase, lactase, and maltase are secreted by the pancreas and the walls of the small intestine. The starches and glycogen take much longer to break down, so that process actually begins in the mouth. Finally, we end up with glucose. If it's maltose, will be broken down directly into glucose, or combination of glucose and fructose from sucrose, and then a combination of glucose and galactose coming from lactase. And it's the monosaccharides that are actually absorbed into the body, and in this case, again, directly into the bloodstream, just like the amino acids are. So this is a figure I've shown you before, but again, this is one of my favorite summations, showing the secretions from saliva glands, gastric juices, pancreas, and liver all coming into the digestive tract to carry out specific aspects of digestion. But then the lipids in the small intestine are directly absorbed by the lymphatic system, which will eventually drop them off into the subclavian vein, which carries it to the heart. But everything else except lipids, so that means peptides, amino acids, the glucose, the fructose, the vitamins, and most of the minerals will be absorbed into the hepatic portal vein, directly into the blood system. And then in the large intestine, while there will be a few vitamins and minerals that are also absorbed along with the water, primarily we're reabsorbing water. All of this, with the exception of the lipids, will end up passing through the liver, where we have the opportunity to detoxify things before it gets sent out to the rest of the body. So that's a quick summary of the digestive process. Good day.